They were soldiers in the time of war, and they were the police in the times of peace. Seumas McManus. Fionn Mac Cumhaill, the most legendary figure of the Fianna, the central figure of the Fenian cycles, also in the times of the most famous and legendary High King of Ireland, Cormac MacAirt. But like a lot of other people, I thought Fionn Mac Cumhaill was just mythical, maybe even a mishmash of all different characters from Irish history, mythology, folklore. But when I've researched this in depth, that Fionn Mac Cumhaill was a real person and died at a real time and was the leader of a real army known as the Fianna. Because according to one of the last great Shanachese storytellers, Seumas McManus, from one of my ancestral homelands, the county of Donegal, says, Fionn and the Fiann were not figments of the ancient poet's fancy, as think some who know of this lore only by hearsay. The man Fionn lived and died in the 3rd century of the Christian era. The 4 masters chronicle his death on the Boyne under AD 283, though he must have died some years earlier. Fionn's early life was a complicated one, with different stories relating to his mother and father. His father was named Cumhaill, and his mother was named Morna. Both had ties to legendary figures such as Conn of the 100 Battles, who was also related to Cormac MacAirt, and his mother, Morna, was potentially the descendant of Nuada of the Silver Hand, king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. This is a fairly extensive and unbelievable childhood and ancestry. Conn of the 100 Battles was the first High King to set up the Fianna as a standing army to protect its harbours and to police the lands during times of peace. I never understood the Fianna in that sense. I always thought the Fianna were some sort of Robin Hood kind of characters just roaming around the forest. I didn't understand that they were an army, but yes, they were. In the Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology and Folklore by Patricia Monaghan, she goes in depth into the story around his mother and father. Definitely take a look at that. In Fionn's early life, it seemed that there was a lot of powerful feminine energy around him. His father died early in battle, so he was brought up by his mother for some time, but then was fostered to his aunt, who was a druid. Also, there was a warrior woman who I guess was friends with the druid, who were teaching Fionn the ways of world wisdom and of fighting from a very early age. So he was showing a lot of promise, a lot of degree of skill. Eventually, when he was outgrowing them, they sent him off to a hermit druid living in the forest to learn more about the ways of the world, about nature. And remember, in these times, the forests were plentiful. They were covering the length and breadth of Ireland. It was a different Ireland. It wasn't so exposed. So you could live in the forest quite well with the game, the animals, the streams, and with the protection of the forest in terms of the elements. And it was while he was with this hermit, Fianachas. This hermit was waiting and fishing for the salmon of knowledge for many years in a specific place. And eventually this hermit had caught the salmon. And if you eat the salmon, you would gain the knowledge, all the knowledge of the known world, and you could see past, present, and future, because apparently this salmon was an reincarnation of Fintan, which I believe goes right back to the Caesar mythology. Caesar was the first woman to come to Ireland, the first invaders before the Partholon invaders. And she brought like dozens of women and only 3 men. One of them was Fintan, and he shapeshifted into animals and was shapeshifting into different animals throughout the ages. So what happened was the hermit asked Fionn just to mind the salmon while it was cooking, while he just went maybe to the toilet or whatever. And while Fionn was minding it, the salmon splattered a bit of hot juice, which can happen from food, onto his thumb. So he sucked his thumb to relieve the pain of the hot juice. And with that, he gained all the knowledge of the salmon. Because the second you ate this, you gained the knowledge, the salmon of knowledge. Fionn immediately became a different person. Like literally just right there and then he could see. He could see past, present and future. He could see the ways of the world. And when the hermit came back, he knew immediately that Fionn had changed, and he knew that something had happened, and he had ate the salmon of knowledge. Fionn grew to be a fearsome warrior and a protector of Ireland, growing into a great chieftain of the Fianna, the standing army of Ireland at the time. Also having his own chief residence in Kildare at the Hill of Allen, according to Geoffrey Keaton, The History of Ireland. Now the Fianna used to be quartered on the men of Ireland from Samhain to Bealtaine, and it was their duty to uphold justice and to prevent injustice for the kings and the lords of Ireland, and also to guard and preserve the harbours of the country from the violence of the foreigners, and from Bealtaine to Samhain to be engaged in hunting and the chase, and in every other duty the King of Ireland might impose upon them, such as putting a stop to robbery, exacting the payment of tribute, putting down malefactors, and so of every other evil in the country. From The History of Ireland, author Geoffrey Keaton. They were soldiers in the time of war, and they were the police in the times of peace. Seumas McManus. To become part of the Fianna, you had to be a warrior poet. Not only did you have to pass through Hell's Week, such as the Marines do in these times, by overcoming unbelievable challenges within the forest, in the rivers, and all over Ireland, you also had to recite vast amounts of knowledge, oral history of Ireland through poetry. So they were the quintessential warrior poets of the time. This is what was the romantic feelings that came from the Fianna because of their love of poetry and their love of protection of Ireland. What is interesting as well is that unfortunately the way of the world, sometimes or a lot of the time the chieftains and the princes' descendants were favoured in regards to joining the Fianna. Now that didn't mean that you got a bypass through these tests and a bypass through knowing your poetry and your oral history of Ireland. You had to 100% pass them. I would imagine that there was others, peasants, that got in as well, but a lot of the Fianna was made up of aristocratic folk that dedicated their lives to the Fianna and the protection of Ireland. If you got into the Fianna, your family, your aristocratic family, has to disown is the wrong word, but they cannot, if you die in the Fianna, protecting Ireland, protecting its harbours, protecting and policing the country, if you die, your family cannot take out revenge, they cannot enact any sort of action on your behalf. It's up to the Fianna, because it's almost like, you're joining a new family when you join the Fianna. Now, when you think about the aristocratic kind of armies and rebellions and stuff like that of later times, like in my case, I've done a lot of research into Brian Ború, and when he rebelled against his own family as such, didn't attack them, but he wasn't happy how his brother was taking care of the Vikings, so what he did is recruited his own Fianna and went off into the wilds of Clare and was taking on the Vikings himself to much success. So he was living in the wilds, and he would have taken a lot of inspiration from Fionn Mac Cumhaill and the Fianna. I would imagine that he was almost romanticizing them as well, and this is what kept him going on the dark nights and on the cold and wet nights, because the Fianna, remember, the stories of the Fianna and Fionn were talked about in the courts of Ireland by the Shanaquis of old, right up until modern times. You know what I mean? Right up until, when I mean modern times, I mean like the storytellers would have continued right up until just into the houses, the cottages of Ireland. They would have been telling the stories. These stories go back 2,000 years and they never relinquished only until recent times. So these stories were inspiring the likes of Brian Ború. These stories were inspiring the later rebellion, 1798, the Civil War, etc. Of course, these leaders were inspired by these stories, but also something to take into account as well. A lot of the time, the rebellions happened, even the later rebellions around the times of 1798 onwards, these were aristocratic people. These were Protestant aristocrats. A lot of them were. It's interesting because I always think that to overthrow a system or to overcome a system, there needs to be breakaway groups within the aristocratic folk, within the actual upper echelons of society, and where they break away from the corrupt entities that's going on, and they need to form their own rebellion against the system. I think the peasants really can't do much until that happens. So as mentioned, there was a romance building up around the Fianna when Fionn Mac Cumhaill was the leader of the Fianna. And now what the Fianna was doing was helping the High King to police the lands and to protect his harbours. So a lot of the time was spent wandering from place to place. And the Fianna wasn't just one group of people from one place. It was a bunch of different groups together under one army. There would have been some competition between those specific groups at different times. We'll get onto that in a sec. But Fionn Mac Cumhaill was from the Munster region, and that particular Fianna, that particular part Fionn of the Fianna, was the most famous because it made up the most romantic, bardic and poet-filled part of the Fianna and the Fenian cycles. So the Fianna would be roaming from place to place, and it would, camp in certain places, meet certain ladies from certain places, make love to them. There would be poetry, there would be living off the land, there would be, there's the saying that every hill that they would have stayed on, they left their mark and their legendary folklore on that hill, and then there would be stories from that hill. In our part of the world down in Munster, there'd be different parts where Fionn would have stayed and would have left his stories. So there was all this romance and all this lore around the Fianna, and that's what I'm talking about today. I'm still talking about it 1800 years later. We're making videos about this, you know what I mean? So it's an amazing part of our history and our mythology, Fionn Mac Cumhaill and the Fianna. So this all built up over time, and Fionn, aged over time, obviously, and he would have been a part of the most famous love story this island has ever told. And I've been building this story up quite a bit because I'm going to go into it specifically in the next video series. But Fionn Mac Cumhaill was betrothed to Gráinne, or the other way around, because Cormac MacAirt was good friends with Fionn Mac Cumhaill. But Fionn Mac Cumhaill was a good bit older. He lost his wife by this point. He would have married and have had kids and stuff like that. Oisin was one of the kids, and Oisin became a great warrior poet in his own right. So Fionn Mac Cumhaill lost his wife, and then he was coming to the court of Cormac MacAirt, and Gráinne was an available daughter, and also Fionn Mac Cumhaill was an eligible bachelor again. So Gráinne, once seeing that Fionn was an old man, actually fell in love with Diarmuid, a younger, very attractive warrior of Fionn Mac Cumhaill's group, and he had some sort of love spot on his forehead, something to do with a love spot, and Gráinne just was hell-bent on getting his attention, and I'll get into this in another video series, but this caused a huge problem. And basically the pursuit of Gráinne and Diarmuid happened because they left together, and so Fionn would have went on this crusade to get Gráinne, and this would have added to the lore and the mythology and the folklore around Fionn Mac Cumhaill as well. According to Seumas McManus, how the Fianna was made up was of battalions. They were called the Fians, I believe. In times of peace there was 3 of them, so that was 9,000 soldiers in times of peace, but in times of war there was 21,000, 7 of those. So we can estimate from that what they actually mean was potential invaders were trying to come over, and the only potential invaders at that time were the Romans. I mean, we are led to believe that the Romans never tried to invade Ireland and they just didn't bother with it. I actually tend to believe that they did try, and they couldn't because of the Fianna. Because what is this all about? Why was there 21,000 soldiers? And of course, even Irish people to this day, they believe the propaganda, a lot of the propaganda of the Romans and of the Roman Catholic Church and of the British propaganda, the English propaganda. They believe it, and they can't even believe the fact that we actually had our own army, even though it's all written about, in the books, like it's recorded, People say, oh no, it's folklore, it's mythology. the Christian monks mythologized a lot of this. And the oral history that was passed on, which was serious oral history, was turned into fantasy on purpose. You know, it was turned into the fanciful stories, and then, you know, not to be believed, it's all bullshit, you know. But it wasn't. This was our history, you see. And you have to remember, in myth, there's a lot of truth. There's a lot of truth in the core of it. So my hypothesis, and also of Seumas McManus, is that this army was protecting us from the Roman invaders. And what happened was they couldn't invade us, so they just said, oh no, we don't want to invade them anyway. We don't want to invade them. So, you know, that's what they said. And then they came up with these excuses about, you know, not wanting to invade us, and, you know, it wasn't worth their time, etc. Nonsense. The other thing is, we have to mention, there was a lot of problems with the Fianna, because ultimately they were, even though they were set up to serve the High King, and this is what they did a lot of the time, they were a kind of a law unto themselves. They kind of were, you know, roaming around, kind of doing lots of different things, and eventually they became very arrogant over time, especially when Fionn Mac Cumhaill died. They started taking a lot of licenses, and they used to start taking a lot of, you know, overstepping the mark. And in fact, they actually revolted against one High King, where they sided with the King of Leinster, and it was actually for probably good reason, because this King of this High King wasn't a very good High King. It was after the time of Cormac MacAirt, and they revolted against this High King, and it was around the time of Oisin, who took over from Fionn Mac Cumhaill, son. Now, they were defeated in that time, and really the Fianna came to an end. But what they left behind was folklore, stories, tales, romances, poetry, and this was all built up over a century or so. And we are left with this, and we're still speaking about this 1800 years later. Now, Cormac MacAirt would have had books, especially the Psalter of Tara, which was cross-referenced between lots of different Shanaquis, lots of different other books. I believe a lot of the Fianna story and how it worked was recorded in this, because it was meant to be an unbelievable authority on how Ireland worked. But this was lost over time, and I think a lot of these books were destroyed on purpose. Fionn, son of Cumhaill, educated and trained by the most beautiful and powerful women of the time, meeting his fateful destiny by eating the salmon of knowledge, and becoming the greatest leader of the Fianna known to us. Not only was it a fanciful and fantastical story, it was a very real one, with a very real army protecting us from the Roman invaders of the time, and also policing the land and keeping the land crime-free. 800 years later, Brian Ború would try to recreate this Fianna through his political motivations by doing campaigns all over Ireland to subjugate the petty kings and the other provincial kings, and to ultimately bring the full country under the control of the High King, not only in name, because there was a greater invader and foreigner coming to the shores. This is indicative of what Brian was trying to achieve. You see, we're not really looking at the story. What was he doing? Why was he doing that? Because you see, in the times of Cormac MacAirt, Con of the 100 Battles, they had a Fianna in place. Not without its complication, but it was there. It existed. 20 to 1,000 soldiers protecting its harbours from invaders. So Brian Ború tried to recreate this, but ultimately met his fate at the Battle of Clontarf. And you see, they won that battle. They stopped the invasions. It wasn't enough. If he survived, if his son survived, maybe they would have kept it going, but it wasn't enough. And I think in the end, Ireland was too cut off from the rest of Europe, and too isolated to basically overcome what was coming. But the idea was there to protect itself and to create standing armies to stop these invasions. Fionn Mac Cumhaill, only second to Cuchulainn as the greatest heroes in Irish history and folklore. Would you believe me? Oh yes.